Hi, good morning, Mark. Merry Christmas and all those kind of things. Obviously, very nice to have caught up with you recently, obviously, at our last board meeting. So, today's the last day of the year, so what I thought I would do is, I know at some stage that you and I are going to connect so that you can get a little bit more sort of background on us and et cetera, from obviously from the operational perspective. But what I thought I would do in the meantime is that there's a few things that we could talk about, or I could at least give you some sort of heads up around, which might sort of refine the questions for you and also refine a bit of the understanding, which may not have come out of the orientation pack that you've already sort of received. That thing obviously is a little bit more designed to give you sort of the base of the organisation, but not a heck of a lot else. So what I'll do is I've got some sort of main points here, and each of them sort of are hopefully enough interconnected that by the end of all of this, it will sort of sit together. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the understanding that I have, and also obviously the understanding that I'm portraying to the board about the aged care industry as a general rule. And sort of the evolution that's underway. There's obviously been some comments around that now. My annual report will speak a lot more to that, and so does most of the sort of documentations that I put through to the board. Probably in the last 6 or 8 months or so, it's been more of a topic about trying to look a little bit further over the horizon, and so I'll sort of give you my sense of that. I'll also talk a little bit about my employment here, and also sort of how I basically from when I started, so not going back too far, but just enough to sort of explain a little bit about coming into the industry, and then sort of how that influenced sort of my thought processes around obviously operating the business in here as well. I'll give you a bit of a rundown of the financial history as well, and particularly around the new building and how that's all sort of unfolded. Also the connection between the cottages and Windsor House and what we're trying to do in that space. Also then I'll talk about more what happens in here in Windsor House, so to speak, in terms of that. You'll find that often the conversations are split between Windsor House and the Windsor House Cottage Trust, which is obviously the village. There's a lot of interconnections now, but sometimes, and particularly in our documentation around board reporting, and so they're still quite separate. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on the operational philosophy that I've also driven in the organisation, which is kind of a different sort of approach to what a corporate would normally sort of, what you would see in a corporate environment. And all this it'll all sort of unfold, and you'll probably see that. It may end up that you'll end up with more questions than answers, if that makes sense, but maybe that's not a bad thing. And also then I'll give you a little bit of a heads up on sort of looking forward, that over the horizon work that I'm doing, just so that you get a sense of also where I'm at the moment, where I'm looking to take the organisation, and also in support with the board, as in the thought processes that I suppose I'm requiring from the board, some of the guidance in that space. One of the things about the relationship between the board, so to speak, and myself is that there's a really good flow of information. Sometimes I'm leading the board, sometimes the board is leading me. So there's a really nice interconnection there. Very, very aware, of course, that neither of us, and I've spoken to this at board level before, and I'm very, very comfortable. What I don't want is a situation where the board is solely dictating what I'm doing, and I certainly should not be in a situation where I'm solely dictating what the board's doing. Neither of those situations are healthy, but that sort of middle ground where we're working really nicely together is really, really cool. And so we'll talk a little bit about the board as well, because I think that's a really, like for you, obviously an interesting space, right? Coming from a different board and probably a different setup. Hopefully this similar sort of, similar thinking around that. All I could say in anticipation of that part of the conversation is that the board and I remain very connected. I think this is the right way of putting it, and it's a really great operating space. There's a lot of trust in that space for us, so it's cool. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll start with the history of aged care stuff. So those are my main themes, okay? Just to see through, so I'll sort of highlight them as I go. Hope you've got a coffee. You might need to watch this over a couple of sessions, because I think this might be quite half an hour maybe or so. Okay, so my understanding, again, when I talk about me coming into the industry, I think it's an important point. I didn't come from aged care. My original background was I was in high performance sport. I was a professional athlete. Came back to New Zealand, became a lecturer at university, went on to do a PhD in sports psychology. But my original training, right from the word go, when I started looking at a professional pathway, was working with disabled children. So I always had a sort of a social bent, if that makes sense. And I actually studied what's called educational pedagogy in Germany, which allows me to then work into the social network. So, for example, like the Nurse Mauds of the world, victim support, prisoner release programs, drug and alcohol abuse, working with disabled children, and so on and so forth. All of those sort of social networks. So my degree in Germany was in relation to that. Suffice to say, all of this happening at the same time as my professional career was sort of pushing through, and as I got older, I moved on. And so it didn't surprise me. It surprised me that I went and sort of explored aged care, but it didn't surprise me that I was searching for something in a social sort of environment, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of like the start of that there. So when I came into the industry, I really didn't understand the industry. I didn't understand the dynamics or where the industry had come from and where it was going to. And one of the things that I set out to do, because when I first came here, I didn't come to this organisation as a matter of crisis. I came here because the previous general manager, who had come down here, so to speak, for a relationship interest, I suppose, that didn't work out. So she then was looking to exit back to Auckland, had begun quite a nice process, and so was of some changes within the organisation. Which was necessary, obviously, but we're not talking crisis, we're just talking good management. And so I came into this organisation with it in a relatively stable, I would say, position, and certainly nothing where you would go, oh my God, we've got to fix the railings, so to speak. So obviously a nice thing to transition into in that space, having come from a place called George Manning House on the other side of town. Which was run by a couple before it got sold off into a group. That was a very interesting experience. We'll talk more about that at another stage. I learned a lot about what not to do, particularly in this environment, from that year of being at George Manning House. So my pick of this is, and trying to keep it obviously as short form as possible. When in the 1990s, obviously the government started to think about how do we privatise an industry that's only going to become more and more expensive to the national government coffers, obviously through the people moving into retirement. The demographers at the time, I would suggest, had a pretty good handle on what the age demographic was going to look like into the future, 30 years ahead, so to speak, and I think they've picked that pretty well. And so that means that obviously by privatising the industry as part of that whole 1980s break up the monopolies of the government agencies, so to speak, and move in as much as we could into a private sort of into private investment. That process unfolded clearly unregulated in some respects, and what I mean by that is that I don't think that the government and the people in the health sector really understood just how maverick the corporate sector was in terms of how they were going to utilise the same philosophy of, so to speak, slash and burn, to minimise everything in order to get the maximum outcome. I don't think they really understood that, and it seems to me over the last 30 years that their contracts with the sector have been nothing short of trying to stem the flow of the corporate model, and So every step, since I've been in the industry since 2014 and started going to meetings with not age concern, sorry, but with our industry sort of managers, it was very, very clear to me right from the word go that the industry continues to struggle with the boundaries that are set by Health New Zealand. They would rather not have those boundaries and run these organisations as lean as humanly possible, because I think, and this is very much a personal thing, I get a strong sense that the government really is only interested in making sure that people don't die on their watch. Food, shelter and water, and pretty much that's good enough. And unfortunately the corporates see it exactly the same. And of course our contracts now have evolved further and further into the quality of life aspect of care, and in many respects the industry, particularly the corporates, are continuing to kick and scream their way into having to do the things that are just costing them money. And so my sense is that that model moving through has only exacerbated the industry's woes in some ways. The corporate model without some fencing, some boundaries, does not work in this industry, because the end user, the care for the resident, is significantly compromised. And so it's good in some respects, I think, that Health New Zealand are in a position that they have to maintain control in order to ensure that some of those human rights issues, so to speak, or the human rights nature of the thought process remains intact. So what we've also seen, obviously, from those days when it became a more of a corporatized model, and like a capitalist corporatized model of aged care, what we've seen is the slow but sure evolution of the user pays system. And the interesting part is that the corporates, of course, want to be able to charge, so to speak, what they can and what the market will, I suppose, suffer, if that makes sense. But Health New Zealand have also struggled with this, and I think they're looking at from the spectrum of the very, very poor within our community versus the very well off. And so what's actually evolved is a situation where there is no single answer. There is no single user pays system that actually functions across the whole sector, because the disparity between the low end and the top end is so large that you can't use an example and say this is how the system works. Of course, government departments want one size fits all, and it's not working. And so that's where you see, for example, particularly in the early sort of 2010s, the charitable trusts such as ours, with older buildings, older plant and machinery, an older way of operating that's not particularly corporate, were getting swallowed up left, right and centre, and sometimes just simply going out of business because they couldn't compete with the corporatization and the, so to speak, chandeliers in the ceiling sort of principle. And of course what's happened is that extreme has gone through now, and what we're seeing is that the organisations such as ours, which are the charitable trusts, where we are now being trusted with the principles of care and quality of life ahead of the service orientation model, which is all about chandeliers in the roof and 3-course, 5-star 3-course meals. So we are starting to see the disparity in the sector being addressed by Health New Zealand in some ways. But I think that is still hugely problematic, because the government sector doesn't really understand the corporate side of things, and the corporate side of things doesn't really understand how to deal with poor people, I think is the right way of looking at it. So here we are at this stage now. We're obviously 2024 going into 2025. The charitable sector has become more interesting to the government, so to speak, and we will survive. And a lot of the other charitable trusts will survive. And without actually sort of putting it this way, there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt in my mind, that it's the charitable organisations such as ours with high reputations for care delivery, in relation to that, are well and truly preferenced ahead of our corporate cousins, who are seen as just basically milking the cow when a person comes in, so to speak. And so we do currently sit in a situation where there is a high need for organisations such as ours, because the people are, the people in the hierarchy of the government departments are people, and they want quality of life ahead of, not ahead of service. I think that's the wrong wording, but I think if you know what I mean. So the chandeliers in the roof aren't providing the quality of life that services like ours, who are spending a bit more money on the small bits and pieces to achieve the quality of life, if you know what I mean. And so that's kind of a difference in the evolution of aged care. The only thing I would like to sort of add to that, looking sort of a little bit over the horizon, clearly between 2033 and 2037, things are going to get very, very interesting. So within 10 years, the industry is going to have its greatest crisis, and that is because nobody's building rest homes, everybody's building villages. But even that, as we know, and you know from your nurse Maud experiences, you will be seeing some interesting shifts and some dynamics changing in that space as well. I don't fear, so to speak, for the industry in that respect, because there's always going to be old people and there's always going to be a need for rest homes to provide care. However, in saying that, what is already on our doorstep now, and very present in our thinking over the last probably 3 to 4 years at the most, actually this is a relatively new thing, the concept of aging in place, that has significant teeth to it, both from a positive and a negative aspect. Positive, hugely positive, is the amount of money the government can save by creating a care situation, so to speak, with ours, where we become an extension of the primary health system. Whereas before, of course, we were more of a lifestyle choice in some cases. And people would choose to go to rest homes because they just wanted to finish off their days, so to speak, in the nicest way possible. The government, however, are spending money and don't want people to have, so to speak, a free ride. And so the ageing in place system has now created, and you'll see in my reports and a lot of the sort of the discussions that I create in and around this principle of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So we have very, very much in a very short space of time become an extension of the hospital system, and so that will continue as long as we obviously are. The vast majority of our funding is through the government contract, and because of that, they obviously write the rules. And so, in many respects, and this is something that you and I, and obviously the board will be talking a lot more about, is the difference in the model that we operate. We're not talking about the corporatization, but just in that whole concept of going from longer term stays, quality of life, sort of paradigm, to a more immediate, short term, ambulant type stays. So I would say is that we're now on the spectrum with a, so to speak, a palliative care, end of life care, nurse Maud situation. We're at the start of that spectrum now, whereas obviously the nurse Maud specialists in that area are at the other end of the spectrum. So there is a significant change in the dynamics for our industry, which is also, I think, a very clear challenge for Health New Zealand, or Te Whatu Ora, whoever the hell they're called these days, very significant challenge when it comes to the ageing population growing and the lack of interest and again that sort of kicking and screaming kind of thing of the corporates having to build rest homes. There is absolutely no interest in building rest homes because they are a loss-making operation. Particularly, and again, I would like to separate the concept of the charitable trust type of environment where we are above water. We are certainly not a profitable organisation, but we are definitely above water, versus the corporates who the thought process of just getting across the line or potentially being on the line is absolutely not what you'd call a significant return on investment for their shareholders, and so they are just not interested in having a millstone around their neck. But of course, when you have a government contract, there's going to be pressure in that space, so yeah, sort of watch this space. Okay, so as an organisation, we are well positioned at the moment, I would say, in relation to what we provide, reputationally what we provide, and also that sense that the charitable trusts do have a better sense from the health funding perspective. The people in the hospital, so to speak, have trust in organisations like ours because they know they're sending people to caring organisations, not service-oriented, money-making organisations. And that, again, it's a human thing. And so we are well positioned in that respect. And as I sort of alluded to in our meeting on sort of middle of December, when you have 92 ins and outs, so to speak, in less than 6 months in our organisation, we do not suffer from a lack of interest in having people come to our organisation. We are significantly ahead when it comes to occupancy, even though our occupancy level is down, and that's something that we internally are sort of thinking about. The occupancy is in some cases significantly ahead of other operators in Christchurch, significantly ahead. I know of 2 places that are in the 60% range. George Manning House, for example, have closed down an entire 20-bed wing because they simply can't, they don't have the people coming in, and so at one stage they kind of kept the staffing at that level, and now they've had to cut staffing appropriately, like literally make redundancy, so to speak. So there are a lot of places where, especially around the corporate side of things, there is some real crisis in the system. We don't suffer from crisis. We suffer from financial challenge, but we don't suffer from crisis. Okay. So, well, that'll be the end of the history of the aged care side of things. Hopefully that's a little bit illuminating. You may well have known or be sensing all of this stuff being in the industry, so to speak, on one end of that, so to speak, service spectrum for Health New Zealand. But that may help for the aged care as a sort of dynamic model. Okay, so just a little bit more about my history of employment. Like I said, you got a little bit of a background of me coming into the industry. A couple of things that I was extremely aware of, painfully aware of, when I first came into the industry. And like I said, George Manning House, I'm thankful for the year that I had at George Manning House, and not in a good way, but in a way of, okay, so this is what it looks like when the system is being pressured to make money ahead of the quality of life outcomes that we try to derive. I said to one of my colleagues a few years ago, I said it wasn't a case of leaving George Manning and sort of like and taking this opportunity here. It was about, once I knew this opportunity was here, I was very quickly gravitated towards it, and I couldn't leave George Manning quick enough, is the short answer. For me, a very toxic environment in terms of both staffing and also what was important for the business. And I fundamentally felt that the organisation was far more interested in the money than it was in the person, the individual, and their care and their quality of life, and that did not work for me at all. Consequently, great to come here. Very, very cool. Okay, so as I sort of came into the industry and had that sort of first year experience, obviously coming here was then a very much a breath of fresh air. Couple of big challenges that I also noticed immediately, and I'll give you a bit of an example. So in my first few days here, I was standing outside reception. There was two ladies that worked in reception. One was the accountant, or sort of the bookkeeper, and the other was the receptionist. And then there was another lady who was also part of the payroll scheme. So I asked one of them a question, and her response was, "Oh, that's not me. That's her area." And that was Sue, the accountant, saying, "Oh no, that's not me. That's her area." And so the fingers kept pointing in everybody else's direction but their own. And so what I found was that, as is probably pretty normal in a corporate way of thinking, in terms of the organisation was run in a very sort of corporate-based model, very hierarchical. That's the other thing I learned about the industry very quickly. When registered nurses, so to speak, are moved into clinical leadership positions and then into management type positions, they take the concept of micromanaging hierarchy very seriously, and very much to their own detriment. And so what I found when I first got here, and very, very quickly, I was on, so to speak, onto the biggest culture shift that we made in those first few years, which was the removal of hierarchy. And that was, I would say, in some cases, extremely challenging, because people were not aware, and felt very, very uncomfortable, very much outside their comfort zone by taking responsibility. There was always someone else up the food chain or down the food chain. It was always someone else. I could always point to somewhere that wasn't me for a reason, for something not working or not operating as well. It took a very long time to shift that thinking and to move the organisation into a space where, at the original sort of outset, there was, I think I worked it out, there were 11 layers of clinical and support operations within the facility, leading from the general manager down, and we now have 4. And the idea behind it obviously is we don't want people having to report to the next person to then get through that person to get to the next person, that real sort of corporate sort of frustration of how do I actually get something done here. So we now have a situation where the staff here are extremely free to get on with their jobs and to solve problems, and in some cases, if not all cases mostly, to tell us the answer in retrospect. Obviously at the start of that process it was a little bit more challenging. Sometimes people were not making the right decisions, and sometimes falling back into that old sort of those old habits of looking for someone else to blame. But we've got there, and so a really nice analogy for me, as to that shift and a moment of I think for me supreme pride, was the situation was a lady had passed away. Her 2 children, one was a stepchild, daughter and husband, and her husband had come over from Australia to spend the last days with this lady. She had passed away. They hadn't even considered the thought about accommodation. So my cleaner came to me and said, from that hallway, says, "I've made an executive decision." So I kind of sat back and, "Oh, okay, I like this, here we go." And she said, "Look, the couple haven't sorted accommodation. Clearly, with Mum just passing this morning, I've said to them that they're welcome to stay in the room if they want to use the room overnight, just to take a deep breath." They were very thankful for that, and they accepted the offer. And so I just, I was like, okay, so that's the kind of decision, that's the kind of thought process that I want my staff to be having. And it's absolutely okay with me that my staff think like that and act in that particular way. The only thing I said to my cleaner at the time was, I remember saying to her, love your thinking, very happy with that, have you offered them a meal? And that was it. Okay, and so it's a very, very clear, sense of that's how we operate. In contrast to George Manning, where I even remember the lady who employed me saying, you just have to get used to saying no. And it was just like, oh my God. Okay, so let's see how that unfolds. Now, here we mostly say yes or well done, because the decisions that the people are making, like I said, I would much prefer that the person makes the decision knowing that philosophically, so to speak, it's going to be very, very tough to be not aligned to some thoughts around empathy and care for individuals. So I was extremely proud of that, that we've come that far from where we were before. Where before, a cleaner, well, she was obviously at the bottom of the heap, and she'd have to get through all of these different layers to even approach the general manager, and all of that's gone. So it's a very, very flat structure now in comparison, which is absolutely brilliant. And we continue to use that as we go along. I think in terms of that side of things, those would be my main lessons that I've learned. From a financial perspective, you're gonna sort of move on to that. The first of the big challenges to that was actually the clinical model in itself in terms of our staffing. Prior to 2018, when I did a full review of the roster and changed it from a pretty higgledy-piggledy roster to a proper 4-on-2 off roster, we were having about $250,000 a year in bureau costs. It was absolutely staggering, and all because people were doing 2 days or 3 day shifts, or 4 day shifts, or 5 day shifts, and of course, it was an absolute nightmare. Anyway, we got rid of that. Went from basically $250,000 a year to $1,000 a year. One of my years. Now we've jumped up a little bit in the last few while. Particularly COVID was a bit of a kick in the backside for us, but inevitably the absolute destruction of our balance sheet from bureau alone was addressed. So that's been really good. The other thing that just before we get into the sort of financial history side of things is the model of sort of the micromanagement type model that we had before, particularly through the management system. There's a million pieces of paper. Instead of that concept of we have a problem, let's deal with it, there was always another piece of paper. There was always another pathway of information. Our computer is so full of crap, it's unbelievable, from years gone by. So again, when I went through that process of, so to speak, disestablishing hierarchy, I also disestablished and removed this incredible level of unnecessary paperwork. So we've got down to the simple fact that we have obligations towards our audit, and we should be focusing on our audit being the process by which we report. And of course, what we've found is that a lot of those things that were being reported, aside from all of that, were just unnecessary fluff, basically keeping people in employment and unfortunately away from the things that they were supposed to be doing. So we've refined that down, and there is very, very little now that sits outside what the auditors want anyway, that keep our operation to a high standard. So in that respect, it's good. Okay, so that's part 2 done. That's my history of employment, the sort of the lessons that I learned and what I did in my management sort of space to try and rectify a lot of those issues. Oh, I should probably say, in the last couple of 3 years, my clinical manager, Jean, absolutely outstanding, is a significant piece of our operational puzzle. Now, I would say, when it comes to clinical operations, whereas when I first started, I was extremely hands-on, had to be at the start, to support the clinical manager who was well and truly overwhelmed. Then, unfortunately, when she left, I employed a very, very poor clinical manager, and that was entirely my own fault. I completely misjudged the person. We went through a little bit of chaos there. But then employed Jean, and she's been a marvel. She's absolutely outstanding. She's a clinical person. She doesn't have a financial sort of background, so I do have to temper some of, well, previously in particular, thought processes around how many people she wants doing what and where, but we've found a good balance now. But I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, I've been able to transition far more out of the operational side of things, the day-to-day operational side of things, and far more into that whole larger projects and sort of looking over the horizon and preparing our organisation for the future, to which I'll explain a little bit more later. I feel quite free in that space now, knowing I can delve back in operationally at any stage. I still do a lot of that sort of stuff. The thing that my staff marvel at still is the fact that I'll take out the rubbish and I'll, whatever's required. If I have to help out and do something, even doing payroll, I can run the payroll, whatever, make the clinical decisions in terms of occupancies and so on and so forth. So I very much sit on the outside of that now. Jean is literally running the show in that particular respect, particularly around the clinical side of things, and I'm obviously looking more after the the logistical and over the horizon stuff, which is fantastic. Great. I've got some big projects on the go, and having time to dedicate to that is fantastic. Okay, so in terms of financial history, so just looking at a little bit about that, I think that from a financial perspective, a couple of things were very, very large on our radar when I first arrived. The management of our finances was, I think, as possibly as good as it could have been at the time with the information that the managers prior to me had. I think they navigated our organisation pretty well. It's obviously a huge kick when at some stage in the early 2000s a decision was made to knock down the old Windsor House and rebuild in the current form that we have now. So this building that I'm sitting in now is the new building with part of the old building attached, but mostly new from 2009. A $12.5 million investment, and obviously that meant that we were going into debt relatively heavily. But I think through good fundamental management of the finances at the time, the organisation obviously ran at deficit over a number of years, but we slowly but surely, you could see the curve moving in the right direction, if that makes sense. And I've just been able to follow on the good work of the managers before me in terms of the financial side of things. Now we've gone from a situation when I first joined the organisation, we would be having to borrow money from the Cottage Trust coffers in order to cover some discrepancy in days between the Health New Zealand funding and our costs, what we're needing to go out. And sort of around 2020, we were able to stop that process. At one stage, we'd got to a point where we were looking at, we were borrowing about $100,000 a week. So borrowing in, 3 days later, exchanging it back out. There just happened to be that discrepancy, and we were able to cover that, obviously, with the good graces of the Cottage Trust money. But like I said, 2020 came along, and since then we have been able to accrue about $1.5 million in cash, which is obviously our war chest. That's a really nice place to be, because it means that we haven't borrowed from the Cottage Trust for 5 years, which is obviously good. And of course that trajectory was there. It was just about making sure that we were on the right track with our operating surpluses year on year as best we possibly could. There is a bit of an operating surplus dynamic which I've been using as a bit of a benchmark Some years we've been able to reach over top of that benchmark, other years we haven't, but in every case that we haven't, it's more about we're still accruing surpluses, just not to a level that I'm kind of, so to speak, comfortable with, knowing what our operational expenses are, particularly looking capital expenditure forward. I'll explain all of that later on. But just to give you that history. So financially, the organisation has, like I said, crawled out of its debt and has some money in the bank. So that's really, really good. Great position to be in, means that we do not have to worry about the small day-to-day costs, the $500 here, $1,000 here. Clearly, we need to manage what that looks like, but inevitably, if my clinical manager comes along and say, rightio, look, we've got some 20-year-old chairs, we need to start replacing those, mattresses, whatever it is, I say, sure, go ahead, do it stepwise, but you've got the go ahead, because we've got the ability to keep the standard of equipment at a high level. And like I said, we don't ever operate in the chandeliers in the roof kind of paradigm. The items that we purchase are for practical purposes only, and they must have a clear goal now and into the future. So that's really, really good. And as far as I'm concerned, all power to Jean, who at that level I'm very comfortable with the decisions that she makes. I haven't yet had to go back to her and say, hey buddy, that's, you didn't really need new tyres for the Mercedes, if you know what I mean. So we haven't had that conversation, which is great. Okay, so financially, yep, we're on the right track. I think it's the right way. As a trust, if we think about the Windsor House Trust, Windsor House, our what's called the BOG, that trust is financial, which is great. We have some headwinds ahead of us, but I'll explain that a little bit more later, but at least we've got a bit of a war chest. The Cottage Trust itself is particularly well endowed currently, financially, and that is obviously a really comfortable place for us all as well. It does give us the room to have some thought about what to do next, and particularly about looking at the quality of life in the village as such. That's a whole nother conversation, and I probably won't talk about that. We're up to 42 minutes already, so I won't talk too much about the Cottage Trust. Maybe that's another part of the puzzle that I can add to you. But clearly my conversation is more about the Windsor House and the clinical side of things in terms of rest home care. Okay, so from financially, pretty good. We have our ups and downs, obviously, and like I said, there's a couple of headwinds on the way, but I'll explain those as we go through. So the next section behind that is my relationship, I suppose, with the board, and then also looking at about that relationship and also the operational philosophy of how we work within the four walls, so to speak. Clearly, my example about the cleaner coming along and talking about the resident family and so on and so forth is a pretty clear indicator around the philosophy, but I'll dig into that just a little bit deeper, because there's just a bit more to that. But just talking about the board and how the board and I, so to speak, are connected. Usual sort of thing. Robin and I meet once a week and sit down and have a bit of a chinwag about the operation. She's kept abreast of as much as I can without boring her with the too many operational details. There's a little bit there, obviously, but I try to obviously not get into the micro detail. That works really well. Obviously, Robin is an ex-nurse, so her real focus is in the conversations around the clinical side of things, and also the driving into that sort of philosophical space about, is this the right thing to be doing? Okay, and so that's a fantastic conversation as far as I'm concerned. It shows the luxury of our environment compared to a corporate, if that makes sense, because this wouldn't be the conversations we would be focusing on in that sort of more corporate setting. So yeah, and I think overall as a board, now the board's evolution has been quite interesting in many respects. As you can well imagine, charitable trusts in the years of foundation moving through until around 2015, 14, 15 or so, I was just sort of on the cusp of some changes that came into effect around 2018, but sort of started in the 2015 sort of time frame. And the board was obviously was derived from 4 from Age Concern and 4 from Rotary, very volunteer, very wanting to do the right thing, very in some cases some extremely high-powered people, in terms of very, very smart people, some good thinkers, big ups to the people who decided to put this building in place, for example, after nearly 50 years of operation of the other building, which was old, smelly and decrepit. So they didn't sort of fear taking another big leap, which was a very, very good thing for us. I don't think we'd be in the same situation we are now if that had not transpired. So yes, very much I don't mean this disrespectfully, but definitely a board of 8 do-gooders wanting to do the best, their community orientation, their willingness to work for the benefit of the aged community, very, very clear motivation. As with all things, you don't necessarily get the business orientation, the business people, the business thought processes in that kind of environment. But over time, certainly 2015 onwards, we did start to see some people with significant business experience and business management experience coming onto the board and really just ensuring, for example, and standing alongside me as we both sort of agreed on a way forward from a financial perspective, and also aligning our financial goals, so to speak, with our operational and philosophical goals. So that process has always been really good, actually. We went through a bit of a crisis in a couple of years after that, where unfortunately, as a result of the poor decision on my part around the clinical manager, that clinical manager and our chair at the time decided that they were going to, so to speak, come into cahoots, and there was quite a significant power play made in that space. Particularly my removal was very much their agenda, and I think the short answer is I'm still here and they're not. So the board chose a different direction, and with that change of direction, they also then started to look at a remuneration for board members, professionalising the board, add to which now the conversation that we have about new board members, in many respects, whilst it is more of an independent decision, I'm always asked what are the core issues that you see, and what sort of person should we be looking at to help enhance our operation, looking a little bit over into the future. And so without having had 5% influence on your appointment in that space, or the invitation to join the board, so to speak, it would only be that somebody, again, from the clinical industrial side of things, looking at that and you've got a trust, so to speak, a more social background, was where I was sort of looking at, because of we've got some challenges going forward about how to maintain our operational reputation in a changing environment, which is more short stay. And guess what? Nurse Maud's, it's core business of Nurse Maud over years has been the short-term palliative end-of-life kind of environment, and so that's a really interesting space, and I really look forward to having those conversations with you going forward. But of course, previously, financial side of things, we needed some investment information. The Robert Harris's, who's still on the board, Caron with marketing. Prior to that, we had an investment, a man, just trying to think of his name. I was talking about him this morning. Actually, he did investment stuff. So terrible, isn't it? Scott Rainey. So we've had these different people who have helped us through these different sort of phases, financial phases as well as operational phases going forward. And so same sort of thing with you. And your conversations with the board going forward will be when somebody moves on. Again, those same conversations. I get my say in that, but it's not a big one. It's just good for them to be able to connect with me. And so it's very, very simple in that respect. So yes, I feel that I've been able to work with the board at all levels. I am the kind of person that I don't have a corporate ego, if that makes sense. It doesn't worry me that the board guides me, and the main thing is that the board and I have to work together on going on a way forward. I've also been the chair of a board, a national sports organisation, and a board member. I know the dynamics. I know my place within that. I don't ever feel diminished in that space. I feel like I am considered a respected member of the team in that kind of conversation and discussion. But of course, board is a board, and sometimes I'm not part of conversations whatsoever, and so it should be, right? I did feel at some stage that when I feel that I've got too much control, I will address that with the board and just temper that back. I never want the board to be in a situation where they would start having to ask questions about that and feel like they are a little bit the mushrooms. It's a very much a no surprises world. I am known for talking, and so you will understand the context in which I'm operating and my thought processes well in advance. I definitely run on the no surprises, high trust environment, if that makes sense from my perspective. And it's great. It's awesome having the different people with the different skill sets on the board in different ways, contributing to my thought processes and being able to give everybody a phone call and say, hey, this is where my thoughts are at. What would you recommend? Brilliant. So it's very loose in that respect and very, very easy. There are no egos in terms of the hierarchical ego, so to speak. Nobody's saying, well, I'm the boss and this is what happens, or I'm a board member and you're not. This doesn't exist. It's a very, very comfortable board. Really good people, just really aligned to the thought processes that they're trying to support. It's great. Love it. Okay, so in terms of moving on from that and sort of adding to that in terms of the operational philosophy, I think it's really, again, really important to understand from my perspective, hopefully for you, that I see the world in very much a sort of dichotomous space. There is a service model, and then there is a care and empathy model. I am very, very much centered on the care and empathy model. It is, I believe, the thing that is more important, the most important thing, in order to maintain the highest reputation with our funders and the people who send the residents to us for care. Because I don't focus as heavily, so to speak, on a service model, that it's all about chandeliers in the roof and everything's got to be tickety-boo. We live in an environment where when people come in, they say they love the vibe. They just get a sense that everything is calm, people are polite, respectful, without any hint that that's a forced environment. And this is absolutely ideal as far as I'm concerned. So I do not go down the road of your uniform's not straight, or sometimes I don't even care if they're wearing uniforms. I care that they are well presented, and that if they want to have a nice frilly top, because as in it's all scrubs kind of thing, but somebody wants to wear something a bit colourful on any given day, you're welcome. And so it's that sort of, we don't compartmentalise into that sort of very corporate Air New Zealand kind of thing. It's very much about, this is our community life, this is life, sometimes the good and the bad, sometimes the ugly, but at the same time, it's all about that high empathy. We actually do care. And so the relationship side of things, the development of all of that is hugely important to the way I see our operation, and why I believe why we still maintain such a high reputation for the people outside wanting to or giving us the people to come here, because they know that the people here is just outstanding. And of course, it's a clean and safe and tidy environment, but we don't diminish our standards. But you wouldn't know that those standards are really important in the system because we just live and work in our environment, which is really, really great space. And so all of the decision making, when somebody, I don't care what staff member it is, I'll have caregivers come into my office and tell me what's what. And so from that perspective, they will talk to me about the things that are important to them. And again, when I first arrived, that was all about things and bits and pieces, and why aren't there chandeliers in the roof if we're not going to make it if we are not sparkly and all those kind of things. And in fact, it's completely the opposite, right? And so, like I said, we don't drop our standards. Our auditing processes around cleanliness, hygiene, due diligence and care, highest standard, no problems whatsoever in that space. But we do it on the basis of the empathy and the care that we really are about quality of life. So that's the kind of the philosophy side of things. It's very, very heavily driven in that space. And so that also means, obviously from a financial perspective, that there's a cost to that, which you would not normally carry in a corporate environment. Which would look, when you look at the financials, and probably an example. So a guy named Michael Ambrose used to work for our accountant firm. He was the head accountant at the time. Also helped set up the Arvida, financial model. He was asked by the board a couple of times over about a 5-year period to come in and have the conversation, and both times was very, very clear that we are underperforming financially. That we should be earning $1 million a year from this operation, right? And both times the board respectfully listened, kind of rolled their eyes and moved on, because clearly the corporate thought processes around extracting every dollar from the business was more important than the actual care that we deliver. So the board, and obviously for myself, and until the board obviously changes their thinking around that, are happy, so to speak, or comfortable to cost a little bit more, but in order to those costs have to be deliberately improving the quality of life of the resident themselves. So you'll find that that's exactly the way we are set up here. We underperform, so to speak, financially compared to a corporate. But we do not spend money willfully. We spend it consciously on the practicalities of quality of life care. So I think that's really important. Like I said, I don't drive a Mercedes, if that makes sense. There are no, other than the gifts at Christmas time and a nice meal with the board, that's pretty much the extent of our luxury here. But we do drive those cost centres far more into that space. Probably another example of that, just before I finish up on that point, using George Manning House as an example. When I was at George Manning House, I was there for a full year. In that year, we spent $160 on call-outs for the doctors. The philosophy at the time was, put them in an ambulance, get them out of here. We don't want the problem. Right? So, of course, our ambulance bill was quite high. And that was also the time when the ambulance costs went from $80 a trip to $200, because they realised that everybody in the industry was just pushing everybody into ambulances and getting them off to the hospital to deal with the problem, so it's not their cost. Now, when we are here, and I look at the numbers, we have consistently spent around 50 to 55 and now heading towards the $60,000 a year on doctors' bills. And the reason for that is that we have two core doctors who come in here once a week for half a day a week and actually look after their patients. And the ambulance at the top of the cliff kind of a process and approach to that is, again, why in the end it's like an investment in that care model that resonates highly with Health New Zealand and the people, so to speak, in the hospital who want the people that are looking after to go to the best possible care environment, and so things like that. So we spend a lot more on the very practical principles of care, and like I said, no shiny watches, no nothing in that respect. We are frugal to a T on the things that don't matter, but to the things that do, we are quite happy to invest and spend the money where necessary, which is, I think, it's great. It's incredibly liberating is the right way of putting that, because we can now deal with the things that are in front of us in an appropriate way for that person and their quality of life. And that is becoming more, with a higher acuity now, that is becoming even more noticeable as part of that. Okay, so that's from an operational perspective, and like I said, if you look at our numbers from a purely financial statistical perspective, yes, we're an underperforming organisation, but that is directly related to the philosophy and the charitable nature of what we do. The balance sheet is well controlled, if that makes sense. There's no spending that shouldn't be happening, or flippant spending. It's all within the purposes that it's supposed to be drawn into. A corporate would just roll their eyes and say you're idiots, but that's why we've got 90-something% occupancy and they generally don't, because they just want to make sure that the chandelier's been polished. I know that sounds a little bit critical, but that's probably where my head's at in terms of the differences between us and the money-making part of the world out there. Which I'm sure, Nurse Maud, you'll be well and truly aware that good spending is just part of the business, right? Not flippant spending, if that makes sense. So yeah, and you'll see that through the financials. Okay, so looking forward, this is the last section. So we're already up to an hour, not half an hour, but as I said, I'm a bit of a talker. So this is probably your second or third sort of deep breath and listening. Oh God, but anyway, one more to go, which is the looking forward side of things. Okay, so as I mentioned, 3 years in, the last 3 years I've been really looking over the horizon, looking at the dynamics of the aged environment, so to speak. What are our demographics looking like? We know that 2033 is really starting to head towards the peak. 2037 is the peak. The end of the baby boom is 2047. That's when we'll see a rapid decline in clientele. I think that if we put that into true numbers, that's 22 years away, when we will substantively, as an organisation, we will be either prepared for the challenge that is going to face us in that space, or maybe not. My job is to try and get us looking out further, knowing what the potential dynamics are. I have to admit that I didn't really see ageing in place coming. It was a relatively new principle of operation from Health New Zealand. In retrospect, looking back, pretty clear that that's what was happening overseas. And it took a wee while for the Health New Zealand to sort of gravitate towards that approach. Like I said, they've wrapped that up into this nice bundle of this is the way, the best, highest quality of life is for a person and their existence. I tend to disagree in some respects. For some people it's absolutely right, 100%. But they're the people who would normally stay at home and were capable of doing that. But what we're finding is that particularly this generation of gratitude tends not to want to make a fuss, and so when they are coming out of home, they are in a very, very poor state, and that's consequently why we're having a lot more short-term stays, or a lot more resources are required to help that person to sort of get back on the curve. So, okay, so that, knowing that's part of the job. One of the things that I've been really focused on is that I believe that we are relatively, and I say that with a little bit of trepidation, relatively optimized in terms of our staffing. Okay, we've gone a little bit top heavy in the last couple of years, probably the last 4 or 5 years compared to where we were in 2018. But that's also been a sort of a reflection of the incredible increase in the paperwork. This is a short answer. We've become a paperwork industry as in, like, it was very, very hard for us to equate the differences between the one and the other. And a lot of places we've been able to obviously develop some better systems and put things into place which are far more efficient, which is great. But my real focus in this next 5 or 6 year block is making sure that we've made an energy transition in particular, and looked at one of the ways that we can very quickly minimize some cost, but also potentially generate some income. And this is no silver bullet, not in the slightest, but what it is, it's keeping the wolf, so to speak, a little bit at the door, particularly over the next 25 years. And that is, like I said, in relation to our energy plan. So stage 1 of that energy plan is really kicking off in the new year, where we will be preparing the building and then installing solar on the roof of this building, a significant number of panels. The operational savings in and around that space, around 40 grand a year. We spend about $250,000 a year on energy at the moment, and so 40 grand a year, $2,500 to $3,000 a month. We're really only looking at a savings around 10%, 10 to 15%, but that's 40 grand less, isn't it? So what happens then after that, unfortunately, is that we have had some significant issues with the piping in this building. The piping was a problem right from the word go. They never really solved the problem, and with the introduction of chlorine into our water supply, the problem was exacerbated to the point that our current $500,000 at least plus GST piping system is basically shagged, and is going to need full replacement. Go back about half an hour in this conversation, I was talking about headwinds into the future. This is one of the headwinds. And so what we've looked at then is obviously solar on the roof, and then the second phase is the replacement of the piping system and going away from using LPG as a central boiler, single loop energy sort of transfer of domestic and heating hot water, to having 3 loops, 2 individual wing loops and then a main facility loop, which will also incorporate the hot water. So 1 big unit down where our ones are, and 2 smaller ones running the domestic hot water, particularly for showers or use during the day. Again, there will be some very, very clear savings in that space. But the interesting thing, of course, is that our electricity consumption is going to go up because of that. But at the same time, it's a kind of a quid pro quo sort of environment. With the solar on the roof, we're going to have our best possible savings in that space, and the utilisation of solar at the time of day when we need it for power generation. So that's all good. And that process now will unfold over the next year or so. The contract for both LPG and electricity are both closing out this new year in 2025. So the goal is to have at least the solar up and functional and operational by August 2025. I suspect that the piping and the installation of the heat pump system will take around till April 2026, at which point, a correction, the LPG contract finishes in August 2026. So I'd like to have that in place and done and dusted before then, maybe have a little bit of fat in the tank in terms of timing. But we've certainly got plenty of time, but that's the main plan. Then, and this is sort of an additional part of it, and this is an interesting sort of economic puzzle that I'm going to be having to work my way through. Haven't really started yet, so it's just very much in a sort of a principles phase, and that is basically utilising the cottages out there and installing solar on their roofs. The idea being that ownership, so to speak, of that system would be through the main facility, the bog trust, with the plan being that we generate the income, we offset the cost of power to the cottages, but just not wholly. Basically, what I want to be able to do is utilise bog to help to reduce the costs of operation here, clip the ticket out there, if that makes sense. So using one to sort of offset the other. Again, I can give you far more about that in the future. So the only other sort of over the horizon thing that we're looking at now is in terms of sort of thought processes are in the main facility here is that our dementia unit. Now there's some questions about dementia which I haven't really been. I know what I'm thinking in that space, just haven't really focused a lot on there. So maybe a good conversation with you would be really interesting on this one, just thought processes. And that is that is dementia going to really accelerate? Do we need potentially more dementia beds than the 20 that we have? Or do we stick with our size of dementia unit here that we have, which is 20 beds? And in that space, if that's the case, 18 of our 20 rooms are actually joint share rooms. And so that's a problem for us because if not each individual has their own individual bathroom, which means that we always have to pair up man with man, woman with woman. Now we keep getting inquiries, but not always necessarily the square and the round peg are not necessarily fitting. So one of the things that we've been thinking about at around $30,000 a pop is to change bathrooms to become single use. Rooms to become single use with its own separate bathroom. There's a bit of logistics involved in that, something that I haven't really tackled. It's not hugely problematic, but it definitely slows down what we could normally say would be a fundamentally full environment. So that's something that we're going to have to work our way through. My main focus at the moment, of course, is this energy plan, getting that underway. We have no choice in the grand scheme of things. We could continue to use LPG, and then we would not be in that sort of environmental carbon sort of responsibility space if we continue to use LPG. So changing LPG to electricity and doing that now because of the degradation of the piping system makes complete sense. The board are very happy with that as well. Clearly, it's a necessity, so we just get on with it. It's once that project is finished, and once we know that, once that's up and operational, then I think the very next one will be attaching ourselves to the concept around individual bathrooms. So with 18 bathrooms, you're talking at $30,000 a pop. It's not small change to make that adjustment. So we're just going to have to let that sort of ebb and flow a little bit and see what the dynamics of costs are and how much that really, how much does that tangibly really affect us? Is that a worthwhile investment? That's the over the horizon stuff for now. So I think at this stage, deep breath, I think that's plenty to start with. I'm sure, like I said, that will generate a whole lot of questions. But if you break it down into those 5 different sections, like I said, history of the aged care. Look, I'm really happy to be. That's my theory. What I started with in terms of the way I see that sort of thing. My idea is always try to know your enemy, if that makes sense. Trying to understand the industry and looking at those where I think that's all pushing and moving. All I know is it's becoming far more user pays, and definitely there's going to be a big shift or big problem because a very small portion of our society can afford and the vast majority can't. And so there's still a lot of dynamics in that space which the government has to work through. Then of course my history about it, how I envelop, that's just knowledge for you. Financial history, obviously going to have to dig a lot deeper into that. It's particularly around looking at spreadsheets and P&Ls. Robert, great man to talk to on that stuff. I can fill in some gaps, but I think that the gaps that I would be filling in are more around how our cost centres, which might in some cases look pretty, well, not alarming, but different from what you would normally be seeing. Some of those questions may be answered when you think about our operational philosophy and the way that we spend our money, if that makes sense. I think the main thing for you, if I may say so, and is that if you're looking for where are the flippant spends, you won't find them. It's very operational, it's loose, it's not as tight as it could be, and we are definitely not as financially we are not at financially at 100% because of that. But of course, that's where the board and myself sort of thinking around that charitable trust. What are we here for? How do we ensure quality of life? Quality of life ensures occupancy because our reputation is high. So that's the kind of the model. And then, of course, lastly, looking forward and the things that we can see. I'd love to have a long conversation, not long conversation, but a good conversation with you about what the future looks like, particularly from Nurse Maud, thinking along the same lines. Are you seeing the same sort of, I suppose, the same trajectory, particularly through the funding, particularly through the kind of care and the delivery? I know you guys are in home care as well, which is a really interesting space for me to be thinking about how do we expand rest home, village, community, and three particular steps of moving out and bringing the community in through those steps, not necessarily in that particular order, but also engaging with our community more, becoming more of a this year, just so to finish up, this year I had the Associate Minister of Health here twice. She was very interested in the way we operate and the philosophies that we are driving here, and I think that that's a perfect example of somebody's going, oh, you guys are on the right thought track. And so she was quite enamored by the way we're doing things, which was really, really cool. And we came up with a conversation around that, and which I'll drop into my working paper 3-page document that I gave her, and just basically said my vision for the organisation looking ahead is that we become a little bit more of a sort of the marae for our aged community, more of a community hub. We don't have, so to speak, an external internal community centre, but that more of that whole concept of aging and quality is driven and sort of promoted through our marae, if that makes sense. So that seemed to resonate really strongly. Of course, as we know, the health industry as a organisation from the government's perspective, it's a big beast, and we're only a small part of that. But it was lovely to have her come the first time, have a bit of a chat. She was brought here by the people at the DHB, who are also, so to speak, very, very pleased and very, very comfortable. They think that we're the, so to speak, the shining light. That the minister then, Associate Minister, came, saw that, and then said, actually, I need to come back and have we need to do this again. There's more conversation to be had. I was obviously very pleased and very proud of that. Right, okay, that's me. Sorry for the long diatribe, but I think that may help you with some background.